All right. Thank you all for joining us today. So what we have today is a webinar, which is going to be focused mainly on people who have some experience with what we refer to as the International Family of Health and Retirement Studies. These are studies which are conducted around the world, longitudinal studies which are representative of a population in different countries, and they follow people from a certain age, like 45 or 50, until the end of life, and they ask a similar set of questions. If you are, this is your first time hearing about this set of studies and data sets, I would suggest you are welcome to stay on for the rest of this webinar. But we also have an introductory webinar, which might be helpful to let you know where data is collected, what kind of data is collected, what countries it's collected in, and some of more of the basics. And what this webinar is really going to focus on is doing some sample analysis using the data from these studies. And in particular, we're going to focus on data from CHARLS, which is the Chinese Health and Retirement Study. If at any time you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask me a question. You can do that either by typing a question in the chat or posing a question in the question box. Currently, everyone else is muted except for me, and so I think we'll just be taking questions via text for this webinar. But I hope you find this useful, and if you have any questions, feel free. So we're going to kind of do this webinar in two parts. The first is going to be an analysis just using the Harmonized CHARLS dataset. The Harmonized CHARLS is a version of the CHARLS data, which we develop here at the Gateway to Global Aging Data, and we're located at USC. And it's kind of a simplified, easy-to-use version of the CHARLS data. It's very user-friendly, and there's a lot of documentation. It does not include all the variables which are part of the actual CHARLS study and CHARLS data set. So it's a subset. And the second part, we're going to be doing a cross-study or cross-country analysis using the Harmonized CHARLS data and the Harmonized ELSA data. And ELSA is the English Longitudinal Study on Aging, and that's representative of England. We just had a question from Yen, which is, will this webinar be recorded and accessible? Yes. If you can't stay for the entire webinar, that's absolutely fine. We're recording it, and we will post the recording on our YouTube, and we'll send out a link to that, and also be available from our website, which is www.g2aging.org. And I'll also provide the slides from the webinar today also. And you'll get a follow-up email after the webinar, which will give you links to access all of those. So kind of the research question that we're going to have today for our sample analysis is, are there differences in financial support to children across different ages? So financial support and how individuals are expected to support their children and or their parents in different countries is quite different and across different ages, and is something that's interesting and is looked at in the ways that there are intra-family transfers that happen in many different countries, but in different ways. And we're going to be looking at China for this first part. There are two, you'll notice, handouts that are available to you. One is called Advanced CHARLS Webinar Part 1, and the other is Advanced CHARLS Webinar Part 2. These are labeled as DOC files, but these are actually DO files. So if you would like to download them and run these on your own, you're absolutely welcome to. You just want to download those and change the extension, that file name .doc to .do. So just delete the C. And these are Stata files that you can use to follow along. Part 1 is going to correspond to our Part 1, and Part 2 will correspond to the Part 2. All right, so here we have our research question. And here are kind of the steps we're going to go through for Part 1. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to download the Harmonized CHARLS dataset. We're going to identify the relevant variables that we want to answer our analysis question in the Harmonized CHARLS. We're going to manipulate some additional variables for our analysis. We're going to apply weights, We'll talk about how to do that. And then we'll analyze giving to children for all of China in this case, and then we'll analyze giving to children by different age groups. Let me briefly take you to our website, and we're going to be using our website for parts of today's webinar. So this is the Gateway to Global Aging Data. It's available at g2aging.org. And for our first kind of thing we need to do is we need to obtain the Harmonized CHARLS. And if you click on the Download tab here, you can find links to all of the survey data. For all these are all different studies which are conducted in different parts of the world in different countries. And then you also have a link to download the Harmonized dataset. So if you follow this link here for Harmonized CHARLS, this will take you to the University of Peking's website, and you can download the Harmonized CHARLS data here. You do have to request access for it, and you have to register on the CHARLS website. Once you've done both of those things, you can download the Harmonized CHARLS. Again, here is that website. All of these data sets, Harmonized and the original survey data, are available for anyone doing research. There's no charge for these, though you do have, there's a small registration process for each study's data set. And we also ask you to register for the Gateway if you are using these Harmonized data sets or information about these studies, which is available on the Gateway. So let's say we've downloaded the Harmonized CHARLS dataset, which I have done, and then we want to identify our relevant variables that we're going to use for this analysis. So we're going to pick kind of 1 year to look at. So far, CHARLS just has, they just finished kind of their what they call wave 4, or the second follow-up in CHARLS, and we're going to be looking at the first follow-up in CHARLS, which was conducted in 2013. And it's called Wave 2. So the first thing we need is a measure of any giving to children. That's a variable. It's called HTCANY. You'll notice we use a very standard variable naming convention. So the first letter there refers to whether it's a respondent variable, a household level variable, or a spouse level variable. So what the information inside of that variable represents. In this case, this is a couple or household level variable because usually couples have children together. And then 2 children, and this is not going to be, we have an amount variable, but in this case, this is just a binary indicator of whether it gives any support, financial support to children. We also have a couple identifier that allows us to group different couples. We want to know the respondent's age and the spouse's age because I said we're going to be looking at different age groups. And then we need a household analysis weight, and we're going to use this variable called R2WTHHA. So there's different ways for you to locate which are the variables you want for a different analysis. And I'd say the 2 ways to do this are, one is on the Gateway website itself. We have what we call our Concordance Search, and that's here at the top. So for instance, we could say we're using the Harmonized CHARLS, we're using the 2013 variables, and you could click on things here for many of these different measures. For instance, let's see, we're using family and social network, so family financial transfers. We also need an age at interview variable, and we need an analysis weight variable. And you can search this, and you'll find links to these variables here, and you can find out more information about them. So that's one way. And the other way is to use the Harmonized CHARLS Codebook. And you can download the Harmonized CHARLS Codebook from our download page. You can see it's right underneath the link for the Harmonized CHARLS itself, and it's a PDF. So let's look at that. All right, here is the Harmonized CHARLS Codebook. You can see here on the left we have bookmarks, and it's broken up into different sections. So we have a section for demographics, health and healthcare utilization, cognition, financial and housing wealth, income and consumption, family structure, employment history, retirement, and pension. And these sections are consistent across all harmonized data sets. That's one of the nice things about using the harmonized data sets, particularly if you're trying to do analysis using data from 2 different of the HRS studies. HRS is the acronym for Health and Retirement Study. So for instance, if you wanted to go into family structure, we could look through and find variables related to the family, and inside of here we would also find the variables about financial support to children. And then in the demographics section, we can find information about our weights and different things. Let's go to that weight page. I'm going to just quickly search for it. So here's our household analysis weight. You can see that there are 3 different household analysis weights which are included in the harmonized CHARLS. And let's talk about why we picked the one that we did of these 3. You can see we have them, in this case, the 1 and 2 represent the wave number, so we have them for wave 1 and wave 2. So the first one is a household weight without non-response adjustment. The second one, this WTHHA, is a household weight with a non-response adjustment. And then that last set there is just for wave 2, and that's a longitudinal weight. So for this analysis, we're not doing anything longitudinal, it's just cross-sectional. And so we have to decide between these 2 first sets of weights. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be using, if you remember, this WTHHA, this household weight with a non-response adjustment. And we want to use this weight because in sampling for the CHARLS, of course, they decide a sample, a weighted sample, and they apply this, they go out into the field, but not every household responds. You can go to some households and people will refuse to be interviewed, or maybe they're not available to be interviewed at that time. So we want to account for that non-response, because generally that non-response is non-random and can affect our estimates, which is why it's really important to use a weight always for analysis. Even though these are, nationally representative surveys, we want to use this weight which accounts for the non-response bias. All right, and then we can get to creating additional variables. So we're going to jump now into using Stata. If you are not familiar with Stata, Stata is a statistical analysis package which is frequently used by researchers, in particular economists. If you are not familiar with Stata, you can absolutely still follow along with this presentation, and I think you can take what you can learn from this and apply it to SAS or SPSS or R or whatever statistical analysis package that you generally use. So I'm going to open up, we have these two files. So first I'm going to open up, I have here the harmonized CHARLS. It's labeled HCharles saved on my computer. So I'm going to open up that in Stata. And then I'm going to open up this first do file, which I downloaded. And you can do that using the do file editor. We can say open. And I'm going to go to C drive. I've got a folder here called Programs and Advanced CHARLS Webinar Part 1.2. So this is a program which I've written for this analysis, and you can run this on your own. So it's not going to require you to type anything. The one thing that you'll have to type is you can see that I've gotten some lines in here which say pause. And that's just going to stop the program where it is. We can talk about what's going on. We can check if there's any output that we've asked Stata to generate for us, and then we type Q to move on through that pause. And we can, if you're not familiar with the do file editor in Stata, you can click execute or .do to start. So the first thing here is we're just going to kind of get a sense of our variables. You can get this also by using the Codebook because we have breakdowns and tabulations. But first we'll check our giving to children variable, that H2TCANY variable. And you can see that we've got 2 categories there, a no and a yes. No is coded as 0, 1 is coded as yes. And you can see that breakdown here. The next thing is we can look at our age variable. So looking at our age variable, you can see we've got a really wide range of ages, which might be interesting because you're thinking, well, isn't CHARLS a study which is specifically about people at later life or older ages, people pre-retirement to end of life? And you can see we've got one 16-year-old in here, a 19-year-old, and then we've got people all the way through 101 is the oldest CHARLS respondent in wave 2. And that's because one of the part of the survey design of CHARLS is that they interview any age-eligible respondent. So they come to a household, they say, is there anyone here in this household who is age-eligible for CHARLS, which is 45 or over? And if they say yes, then they'll interview that person and their spouse, regardless of their spouse's age. So clearly there's a few much younger spouses which are interviewed as part of the CHARLS sample, and those people are included in that data set. But so we want to be aware we've got all different ages here, but our median age is 59, which sounds about right. And you can see, let's see, we have one more question from Jipan. Hi, Tristan, I'm a SAS user. Can I directly run the do file on SAS? No, this is a program, the ones that I provided as part of this webinar are specifically for Stata. We do have examples on our website of SAS programs. So if you go back to the Gateway website and you click on documentation and you scroll down to recent presentations, I don't have them linked here, but I'll link them afterwards. And we have SAS versions of not exactly this webinar, but like a similar kind of webinar for SAS. Also, SAS and Stata are not too different. The way you set up commands is somewhat different, but the commands themselves tend to be the same or similar. So I think following along today in Stata would probably still help you with SAS, and I'll add those SAS programs back here on our recent presentations after this webinar. And then Kai Ping asked, would you mind sharing the Stata do file you created? Yes, so these, anyone who's on this webinar right now, these are already available to you. It's in what's called, in GoToWebinar, they're called handouts. And there's 2 handouts which are available to you. They're called Advanced CHARLS Webinar Part 1 and Advanced CHARLS Webinar Part 2. And both of those are available to you. You can download those and just change the extension from .doc to .do. And those are the do files, and that's exactly what we're running here and looking at. All right, and I wanted to just kind of give you a sense of, we'll jump back to our slide here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a couple tag. And what this means is that the Harmonized CHARLS is saved as a respondent level data set. So each record, each additional line of that data set represents an additional person. But what we're looking at today is a household level measure, right? So whether someone gives financially to their children is usually something we think about a couple doing together. So because it's a household level, we only want to analyze one observation per household. So how we do that is we create a tag. And we do this using theegen tag command inside of Stata. And it's quite simple command to write, and we say egen h2 couple tag is equal to tag h2 cup ID. And if you remember that h2 cup ID is the identifier of couple. So if we look here actually at our data set, we just put a little list here of our data set. We can see that here in for observations 1 or 2 are both part of the same couple. We list here their person numbers. We have person 1 and person 2 inside of this couple. And then you see what their value is for their tag. And you can see for these 5 different couples that we have, we've tagged one of these observations. And this tagged observation is going to be the one that we're going to do the analysis on. And why this is important to make sure, because we're doing a household level analysis, that we're only tagging one respondent per household, is because, of course, there are also households or couples with a single individual or a widowed individual who doesn't have another person or a person whose spouse wasn't interviewed. And if we believe that these are somehow these households with one person as opposed to 2, if they're significantly different in some kind of way, we don't want to basically overweight for our analysis to really reflect more about people who are in 2 people couples, right? And if we didn't apply a couple tag, then we'd be counting every respondent twice who was in a two-person household. And so our numbers would be much more representative. Whatever our estimates are would be much more representative of two people couples or two people households, as opposed to single or widowed or spouse absent households. So I hope that is clear. You're welcome to ask more questions. If not, it's kind of a tricky point that some people are confused by. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a couple age indicator. So of course, a couple is made up of two people, and they usually often have not exactly the same age. But we're going to make up one age to represent this couple, because we want to look at different ages for different couples. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to be making our age based on the minimum age between the couple. Usually in most societies, this will represent the female's age inside of the couple. So we're going to use this EGEN command inside of Stata. We're going to make a variable we'll call H2 minimum age, and it's going to be equal to the row minimum of those two variables we saw before, which is the respondent age at wave 2 and the spouse age at wave 2. So for instance, if the respondent's age is 50 and the spouse's age is 49, then the minimum age variable is going to be 49 here. The value for that variable is 49. This is, of course, not always the way you would do this. We're talking about support to children, which I'm assuming is maybe a little more related to the mother. So we're kind of using the minimum age here. Often if people talk about analyzing income by a couple, they'll talk about the maximum age, because usually men have more earning potential in most societies. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a categorical variable which groups these couple ages differently. So we can do this again using an EGEN command. You'll notice I use this EGEN command a lot. It's one of the helpful things about Stata is that you can type things that might be several lines of code as one line of code in this case. So we're gonna make a variable, generate a variable called H2 age category, and we're gonna say we're going to cut our household or couple level minimum age variable, and we're gonna cut it at 50, 60, 70, 80, all the way up to 110. So let's do that inside of Stata. And then we can tab it and we can see what that looks like. So you can see we have this group of people who are 50 to 59 and their couple age, 60 to 69, 70 to 79, or 80 and older. And you'll also notice this 80 and older category is pretty small inside of CHARLS. You'll also notice here that there's a lot of people who don't have any value for this. And that's, of course, because their couple age was much smaller, was probably below, in this case, was below 50, and so they're not included here, which is 23% of this sample. So you could also probably look at a couple age of 45 to 50, but I wouldn't want to go below 45 when using CHARLS because it wouldn't be representative, because they didn't make an attempt to representatively sample people who were below the age of 45. So for this kind of simple analysis, we're just going to use these 4 age categories. And then we want to apply weights. And one of the helpful things about Stata, again, is that it's built fairly well to look at survey data. And in this case, it's kind of simple, this command here. It can get much more complicated depending on the amount of information that a study gives you about how its sampling was done. But we can say SVY set, which is kind of set the survey design. And here, all we are going to do is we're going to tell Stata our weight. So the weight is R2 WTHHA weight. We can do that inside of Stata. You can see we've applied this household weight, R2 WTHH. And then the nice thing about Stata is instead of retyping the weight for the rest of the commands that we do, Stata is going to recall that we used this weight for each additional estimate that we generate. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to estimate the frequency of giving to CHARLS giving to children for the full CHARLS sample. And we do this by using SVY comma, and that SVY comma tells Stata to recall however we set the survey design. Also in the survey design, you can specify what was the stratification and clustering of that sample. CHARLS doesn't include those variables as part of its public data set, so we can include that here, but it's really helpful for a lot of studies so you can get better standard errors. And then we're going to say subpop if H2 couple tag, and that's kind of shorthand in Stata for if H2 couple tag is equal to 1. And again, because we really only want to make sure that we're equally weighting all households, or all couples in this case, and only taking one observation per household. So that will subpop will do that. And then we'll just type mean. So we'll estimate the mean of H2 CANY. So we can jump into Stata and do that. Again, I'm just getting through Stata here by typing Q after the last pause and enter. So we can see here that in this subpopulation, we're including over 9,000 individuals a part of the CHARLS sample, and we're estimating that on average for the full CHARLS sample, which is representative of people 45 and older in China, that 34.8% of them do provide financial support to their children. But our original question, of course, was, is this different for couples of different ages? So let's first estimate again this frequency, but let's limit it just to couples who are 50 to 59. And then we can estimate it again for kind of our oldest age couples who are 80 and plus. And we're going to do that using a really similar command as we did for the full CHARLS sample. The difference is we're going to add one more condition to our subpopulation parentheses there, which is in range, and we're going to list our variable of our household minimum age, and we're going to say in the range of 50 to 59, and then we're going to estimate that mean, and then we're going to do it again for the range of 80 to just kind of a maximum age, which is beyond anyone's age in CHARLS, we know, of 110. So first, once we estimate this for couples 50 to 59, we can see that that the average couple we would estimate who has a minimum age of 50 to 59, we would estimate that 38.4% of them provide financial support to their children. And if we go to our next step and we estimate it for couples who are 80 and over, which is a much smaller sample size here, which is something to keep in mind, we would estimate that 24.8% of them provide financial support to children. So it does seem to be quite different by age. So maybe there's a kind of age difference here, age or time difference. And then we can test whether whether these are significantly different. So we have two different estimates, and if we look back at Stata, you can see that we have confidence intervals on both of those. And you could use the kind of confidence intervals to estimate whether we think these are statistically significantly different, and it looks like these are. But there's another way we can do this, which is do an actual test. So in this case, we're going to kind of re-estimate it for all of our 4 age groups. So we'll say SVY subpop, and in this case, just if couple tag, right? So only one observation per couple. And we're going to estimate the mean, but then we're going to include one more option here, and that's the over option. And we're going to tell Stata to estimate this over our 4 age categories. That's that age categorical variable that we generated earlier. And then once we have those estimates, we can test the difference between the group 1 and the group 4 of that age category. So let's look at that. So you can see here that we get 4 different estimates for our 4 different age groups. What they're calling subpop 1 is, of course, 50 to 59. Again, we see that 38.4, 0.5. And then subgroup 4, it seems like quite less. Again, this 24.8%. And then we can do this test. So you can see here, this is how you This is called a post-estimation test inside of Stata. And we can test the difference. And Stata is going to perform an adjusted walled test. And you can see here, based on the probability of it being greater than our F statistic, that it looks like these are statistically significantly different. So the level of financial support is statistically significantly different for couples who are in their 50s versus couples who are 80 and older. We can also, if you're interested, we can look at this graphically in a graph that I drew, and you can kind of see the differences for the estimates and confidence intervals for our four different age groups. And you can see, interestingly, it looks like 50 and 60, there's almost no difference. But once couples are in their 70s and then again in their 80s, it looks like they do provide often, we would estimate they provide less frequency of giving to children by age. Of course, this is just saying whether you give any financial support to children. And it could be that if you looked at the amount variables and estimated the average amount that was given, you could see a quite different story. So if this were a real analysis, that might be my next step, is maybe to look at the amount variables, or to look at perhaps there's differences here in children's ages. Maybe that's what's driving this, is that people in their 80s, their own children are, maybe in their 60s or 50s, and so they're requiring less support, whereas people in their 50s, have children in their 20s through 30s and require more support. But it looks like we found that there is some kind of age-related difference here. So for part 2 here, our next research question is we're going to ask, we're going to use this kind of what we've done for the Harmonized CHARLS, and we're going to compare it using the Harmonized ELSA. And of course, this is data about England. And we're going to say, how does financial support to children in England compare to financial support to children in China? So the next thing we need to do is download the Harmonized ELSA, just like we downloaded the Harmonized CHARLS. We're going to identify relevant variables in the Harmonized ELSA. We already know those for CHARLS, so we're not going to go over that again. We're going to create a pooled, or sometimes called a stacked data set, with observations from both harmonized data sets. We're going to prepare our variables. We're going to apply weights. And we're going to analyze giving to children across countries, and analyze giving to children across ages and countries. So one thing we can see is if there's just a level difference in giving to financial support between England and China, but we can also see if there's a pattern difference across different ages between China and England. So to download the Harmonized ELSA, you can visit this website here. You can also find a link to this on the Gateway to Global Aging Data on the download page, just as we did for the Harmonized CHARLS. So you can see here we have ELSA here in our third column. You would go to the UK data service and you could download the Harmonized ELSA data. If you remember, in my data file, I've already downloaded it. So I've got the Harmonized ELSA. It is named HELSA. And then we want to identify relevant variables in the Harmonized ELSA. We want to compare the same year between CHARLS and ELSA here. CHARLS was conducted, wave 2 was in 2013, so we're going to use the wave 6 of ELSA, which was 2012, as being somewhat similar in close years. So we're going to need a measure of any giving to children, which in this case, because we're using wave 6 of ELSA, the variable is named H6TCANY. If you remember, for the Harmonized CHARLS, it was H2TCANY. So those variable names let you know that they're capturing the same information, just for different waves. We get our couple identifier, our respondent age, our spouse age, and then what we want is a household analysis weight, just like we had for the Harmonized CHARLS. We've got one slight hurdle to overcome here, which is that ELSA does not provide household weights. So we're going to use the individual or respondent level weight that ELSA provides, and we're going to make that into a household weight, and we'll talk about how to do this. Again, if you wanted to find any of these variables, you could use the Concordance Search on the Gateway website, or you could download, and I would definitely suggest downloading the Harmonized ELSA Codebook. Again, it's very similar in structure to the Harmonized CHARLS Codebook. You can see here are different sections, and you could go into any of these sections. For instance, we can go into family structure and look at our financial giving transfers to children variable and find out that variable name there or more information about that there. So what we want to do is we want to create a pooled data set. Again, I said sometimes it's called pooled or stacked data set. And we have this data code available. This is in the Advanced CHARLS webinar part 2 .doc or .do if you've already shortened it file. So I'm going to open up, I'm going to close this current version of Stata. Don't need to worry about saving our changes. I'm going to open up a new version here. And again, we're going to use our do file editor. So let's open up our do file editor. And we're going to open Advanced CHARLS webinar part 2.do. And in this case, we do need to make just two modifications because we need to tell, we haven't loaded any data set first. If you notice, we just opened up Stata as kind of a blank window. So we need to read in and tell Stata where is the Harmonized CHARLS data and where is the Harmonized ELSA. So I have both of these stored on my computer in my C drive in a folder called data. You can have these stored wherever. You just want to change these folder locations to represent that. We can save that, and then we can start running again by pressing execute.do. So you can see the first thing we do, I'll jump back to our slide, might be a little easier to read there, is we're going to use, which means to read into data, into the current working memory of Stata, this list of variables using Harmonized CHARLS. It's also completely possible to just say use hcharls.dta inside of Stata. And what that would do is bring in the entire Harmonized CHARLS. Then that works depending on which flavor of Stata that you have, but some versions of Stata don't allow you to pull in more than a certain number of variables, which isn't a hindrance as long as you know which variables you want to use first. So in this case, we're going to tell Stata, I want to use the Harmonized CHARLS, and I'm just going to use these 5 variables from the Harmonized CHARLS. So it's going to pull in all the observations, but only 5 variables. And then we're going to use the append command. So append using helsa.dta. And in this case, we have 2 different options here. The first is keep, and we list our 5 variables that we want to keep from the Harmonized ELSA. So again, we're not pulling the entire Harmonized ELSA into Stata, just these 5 variables. And then we're going to generate an append variable, which says whether this observation that was brought in, whether it came in from the append command or whether it was already existing inside of the Stata working memory. So what append does, if you're unfamiliar with it, is it takes all the observations which are brought in through the append command, and it puts them below the current observations that are already in Stata's working memory. So which is sometimes why this is called a stacked data set, because basically we're going to stack the ELSA data right below the CHARLS data. So we can do this inside of Stata. So you can see here we've brought in the CHARLS data. If you open up the variables window, you can see we've got our variables here. In this case, our 6 variables from CHARLS. We can type Q to enter the next command. And we're going to bring in our Harmonized ELSA variables. So you can see now we've got some variables which are called H2 variables. We know that those are from CHARLS, and our H6 variables, we know that those are from ELSA. And we're going to do a couple other things. And we want to make an indicator besides just this append variable, which is going to tell us where these observations came from. So we're going to use a recode command, and we're going to say everything that's 0, make a 1, everything that's a 1, make a 2, and we're going to call this new variable country. And then we know that all the observations which have a value of 1 are from China. All the values which has an observation, or all the observations which have a value of 2 are from England. And then we're going to name this variable. We'll give it a label of country also, and we'll apply those value labels. This will make our output a little easier to read later on. This step isn't necessary, but it's helpful to always kind of apply value labels and variable labels. So when you're starting to get output through Stata, you know exactly what this output is in reference to. So if we jump back into Stata here, let's do that. Our next step, we want to create, I mentioned we have to create an ELSA household weight because ELSA only provides a respondent level weight. And what we're going to do, how we're going to do this is a respondent level weight is basically the probability of non-response at the household level, and then the probability of non-response inside that household at the individual level. So what we know is that usually there's going to be the household weight is always accounted for inside of the individual weight. So we're going to take the minimum of the household weights, the two household weights, again, because of course there's two respondents in many couple households. So we're going to take the minimum of their two weights to represent the household itself. So we're going to, the other kind of thing to keep in mind here is that ELSA applies 0 weights for some respondents, and that's because they don't represent the sample. So for instance, if they're a younger spouse, they can't assign them a weight because they're not representative of the ELSA sample. You can find out more about this using the Harmonized ELSA Codebook, which documents a lot of this. Then using by sort H6 cup ID, we're going to, so using our kind of couple identifier, we're going to generate this household weight, which is the minimum of the individual weights between anyone who is part of that couple. So you can see that we've done this here inside of Stata, and we can find out more information about this using the sub command if we want. So let's see, R6WTHH. So you can see it ranges from 0.34 to 6. For our next step, we're going to adjust for the differing wave numbers in variable names. So you notice our variable names use the wave, which are specific to that study. But of course, what we're really looking at here is not the same wave between ELSA and share. We're looking at the same year. So let's make variable names which reflect the year that these are conducted. In this case, we'll use 2013 because that's what we use for CHARLS. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a variable called H 2013 two children any. Again, that kind of same variable. We know that if your observation is from the CHARLS data, that information is going to be stored in the H2 TCANY variable. And if you're from the ELSA data, it's going to be stored in H6 TCANY. We're then going to do something really similar for our weight variable. Again, just accounting for that variable naming convention difference. We're going to do that for our respondent age variable and for our spouse age variable. If we jump back into Stata, we can do that. All right, and now if we look at our variable window, we can see that we've got these 4 variables here, which we're going to use for our analysis, which have information both from that represent both observations from CHARLS and ELSA. Let's see. So we have a question here. Why should we use the minimum weight of the couple to represent the household weight? So as I mentioned, this is not maybe the best. It's not the only way to do this. It's most helpful if the study provides the household weight itself. ELSA did not provide the household weight. So as our workaround, we're trying to kind of recreate the household weight because we know that the household weight is accounted for in the individual level weight. So the individual level weight could only be, could kind of be more different than the household level weight itself. So if we take the minimum, we think that's the closest way of getting to that household level weight for ELSA. And then just like we used, let's see, Ada just asked, maybe we can use the average person weight as household weight instead. You could, again, I would suggest, let me see if I can put a scenario out there. So if they come to a household and this household responds, right, there's a probability that this household responds. And then there are two people inside of this household. And maybe one of those is a 50-year-old male, and one of those is a 70-year-old female. So then they're going to get a probability weight, which is reflective of that person being available in that household. So one of the things about a lot of these studies is that particularly for males at working ages, they're less likely to respond because they're less likely to be in the household itself. Because they're at work or they're working longer hours, or in some societies, women are more likely to stay home itself. So the male's weight in that case might be higher because it's accounting for that a male is less likely to be inside of the household at that moment. Whereas the 70-year-old female that he is there is maybe even overrepresented inside of the ELSA sample comparative to other groups, so her weight might be much less. But in this case, what we want to do is we want to kind of, ideally, we want to not account for the individual, though probably the individual is going to be in the household, but just the household. So we use the minimum as the lesser of the two. All right. Oh, so we're going to create our couple tag. We're going to do this first by creating a kind of couple ID, which is year specific, just like we did before. And then we're going to create a tag just like we did before. The only difference here is in our EGen tag command, instead of just having our couple ID, we're going to add the year country. And what that does is kind of cross tab all the different couple IDs by country. So if there is a couple ID which is the same in ELSA as it is in CHARLS, Stata will know that they are not the same couple, that they're kept separate. And then we create our household minimum age, or our couple level minimum age, and our age categories. And we're going to keep those same age categories of 50, 60, 70, and 80 and over. We can apply our weights. And in this case, we're going to use the SVY set command, but we need to give Stata more information because the weights are different and they're constructed differently for CHARLS and for ELSA. So we need to tell Stata that these weights aren't necessarily comparable in the same way. And we do that by using the strata command. So our weights are in this case going to be stratified or different for different areas by our country variable, that country variable that we created. This is important to do. You can find out again more about how each of the weights were created and what they account for in the harmonized codebooks, both the harmonized CHARLS codebook and harmonized ELSA codebook. But we want to make sure that we tell Stata to keep the weights, the weights only represent something representative inside of each strata itself. We can then analyze giving to children across countries. So we can estimate the frequency of giving by country in both studies. Again, this is going to look familiar. We're just going to say SVY. Again, recall what we said in SVY set. So in this case, not only our weight variable, but our stratification variable, which tells Stata about our weight variable. We're going to set our subpop, again, to be anyone who, any observation which has that couple tag. And then we're going to add an in range here for the household minimum age between 50 and 110. And why we want to do that, because if you recall, I mentioned that the survey design for CHARLS looks at people who are 45 and older. But for ELSA looks at people who are 50 and older. So we want to make sure when comparing two studies, and especially we're going to make an estimate that's not specific to ages quite yet, but just for the samples themselves, that we want to make sure that we're comparing samples of the same age. So we want to account for this difference by only considering couples who are 50, have a couple age of 50 and older for both of the studies, even though there's going to be quite a few people inside of CHARLS that this won't account for. We're going to estimate our mean, and we're going to do this over different countries, so over the two levels. So let's jump back into Stata. So you can see here that we would estimate for the CHARLS sample, which is has a couple age of 50 and older. We would estimate that 37.2% of these individuals financially support, or these couples, excuse me, financially support their children. Whereas in England, we would estimate that 21.3% of these couples would financially support their children. So these are, of course, different. We can look at this graphically, and we can see this estimate both for China and England. This is exactly the same estimate we just saw, just a little nicer to look at a graph, and we can see that there is quite a difference here. And looking at our confidence intervals, it would be a statistically significant difference. Of course, whether this result might be surprising to you or not surprising to you. And of course, there are a lot of differences. There are a lot of things that could be driving this difference. Things about culture, things about family, things about religion, things about how financial structures are set up. So often, when people are doing analysis comparing two different countries, they do a difference in difference approach. So you can talk about just the level difference. Level, I mean one estimate for China and England. Or we can talk about a difference in difference approach, which is looking at the differences in China versus the differences in England. And that's going to be our next step, is we're going to look at, sorry about that slide, we're going to estimate the frequency of giving to children by country and age in both studies. And this is quite simple. So what we can see is that if there's a difference in the different age groups in China, which we saw, then the difference for the different age groups in ELSA, which we're going to estimate for England. So we're going to use basically exactly the same command that we used before, but we're going to do this over country, and in this case, you can see here in our command, we'll do it over country and our age category of age 2013 age category. And instead of 4 estimates this time, we're going to get 8 estimates, right? So we'll get 4 estimates for China and 4 estimates for England. If you will recall, these are the similar estimates, exactly the same estimates actually as we got for China for our 4 age groups. And then we can see our estimates here for England. Again, they are less at all levels than they are in China. What we want to know is if the pattern is different. So for CHARLS, we tested the difference, whether the distance was statistically significant for the youngest age couples and the oldest age couples. So let's look at that same difference for ELSA. So we can see for our youngest age couples in England, those are 50 to 59. We can see that we would estimate that 17% of couples in their 50s would financially support their children, and for couples who are 80 and older, we've got like 18.9% of couples we would estimate financially support their children. So it seems a little bit higher for the oldest age group, but it's not really clear how much higher, so we might want to test that difference. Again, we can use that using our post estimation command with test, and we can test the difference. In this case, we'll test the difference between subpopulation 5 and 8, and you can see that difference. And then based on the probability here, the p-value greater than our f statistic, we can see that difference is not statistically significantly different. And if we want to look at that graphically, you can see here, we can also see all 4 age groups for each country, so age estimates here total. And you can see what looks like a different pattern. So for England, it looks like it kind of continually falls through ages. I mean, for China, it looks like it kind of, the frequency of giving is estimated to decline with age. In England, it looks like the pattern is quite different, right? So it looks like we see a statistically significant less difference for our youngest couples than couples in their 60s or 70s. It kind of increases in your 60s and 70s, and then it appears to decrease maybe a little bit in your 80s, and it looks much more similar. So it kind of has a mountain or an inverted U shape as opposed to the decline we saw in China. So there's, of course, a lot of interesting things like what could be driving this. that you might want to look at. Again, I would suggest my next step, if I was looking at this, would be these amount variables. And if I'm looking at just the amount that's that is given to children from parents, I wonder if you kind of see a similar difference in patterns or difference in difference for these different countries. And that might be the next step. But this is just kind of a simple analysis that I wanted to walk you through, both just kind of to give you an idea of how to analyze the harmonized CHARLS inside of Stata or SAS or SPSS. It's not too different. And then how to do some of this cross-country comparisons, which are really nice in using harmonized data sets, because of course you remember all our variable names were constructed the same way. They were named similarly. We had variables that were created to capture the same thing. Of course, we have these age variables for both the spouses. We have this binary of whether giving any financial support to children, which are created the same way. And you could easily compare these kind of country differences. And then you can look at what drives these country differences, which is what makes this set of studies and data so powerful. So thank you all for joining me. Again, I would suggest to get access to either of these studies or the many other studies which are available as part of this network of health and retirement studies around the world. You can visit g2aging.org. We call that the gateway to global aging data. We also have a help desk for any of your analysis, so you can send us an email at help@g2aging.org. We always try to answer your question within 24 hours and get back to you. We have a whole team of people here who work on these studies and data set. There's also lots of documentation on the gateway to global aging data, as well as a publication search, interactive graphs and tables, and some other helpful tools there. And so, we're really interested in helping people begin to conduct